Tell
definitely.
me a little bit about yourself. Tell me,
Well,
what you do, what your background is.
what I do is pretty much I'm in privacy consulting. So I that is my gig. I'm all about privacy advocacy. So growing up, I've always looked for basically helping the little guy promote privacy rights. So if you had, so I, it's kind of hard because it's funny that we met because I was about whistleblowing. So I'm always been a whistleblower or been the person running to HR saying someone's rights haven't been advocated for. So and it's probably because we moved around. When I read your LinkedIn about me, I really resonated with that because we were the kids that moved around a lot too. And my little brother was the one that was always getting picked on. So I was the one always running to the teacher saying my brother's getting picked on or he's being bullied. And I was the one always fighting for the bullies or fighting for the little kid that was getting bullied. And it carried over into the workplace. So whenever I saw someone that was getting bullied or discriminated against, I was the one running to HR fighting for that person, which meant that I was always the whistleblower. And what happened was I discovered that in a culture that said, we are the best employers and we are the ones that advocate for having policies and procedures to protect people from being discriminated, if you were a whistleblower, you actually kind of got a target on your back because you were the person that was always rocking the boat and saying that the brand wasn't actually as shiny as everyone pretended it was. The culture wasn't actually as clean because I was the one saying leaders weren't protecting the ones that they were supposed to. Nobody wanted to have a black mark on their reputation saying that they actually had a problem. And what happened was because they weren't following what, and I don't know if I can say this on your podcast, but there's a book written called The No Asshole Rule.
Mm-hmm.
What happened was leaders would cherry pick an asshole. They would hire someone who would be the bulldog in the pen who would clean up a certain department. But what happens is when you hire these bulldogs, they were horrible leaders. So you might have a great culture, but you would hire this bulldog who treated some of the staff and they would ruin the culture because they would treat employees poorly. They would be a jerk or they would be a bully. They would be a great performer. They would have all the budget. They would be really great at their job, but they would be a horrible leader.
So that's an interesting point. How can they be great at their job? Yeah, I just want to just keep talking about this now. Like, how can they be great at their job? Like, them being great at their job is a function of some criteria that they're being judged against.
So they would meet all their key performance indicators. So for instance, they would balance their budget. So for instance, I work in the health authority. So they would be a great brain surgeon. They would be great on all their surgeries, a heart surgeon.
Objective things.
Objective measurables, but they would have horrible bedside manner. So for instance, all their nurses and their doctors would have high absenteeism because they can't work with the doctor because the doctor would literally throw his charts at them.
Yeah. So why do you think it's so hard for leaders to have more of a balanced, holistic approach to what makes a good performer? Is it laziness? Is it just the inherent nature of some of these sort of more ethereal, more sort of subjective things that they're harder to kind of pin down? So it's just like, we just won't even worry about it. Like, what is it, and how do we sort of address and fix that?
I think the problem is I think people start promoting people based on they used to promote based on CVs. So basically, if they want someone who looks good on paper. So if you have in the health authority region, so for instance, if you look good on paper, so you've written so many papers, you have so many letters behind your name, you look good on paper, so we promote you because you are the most accredited person and we want you on our board. But you've never taken an HR training course. You've never taken a webinar on how to be a people person. So what happens is we now give you, with your designation and your new leadership role, you now have 50 direct reports. And now you're supposed to lead them. And you've never even done a public speaking Toastmasters course.
So there's these things that sort of come along with a job or a promotion that they're frankly just not even equipped to get. Like you're putting
No.
someone into deep waters and they've never swam outside of a pool before or something.
And part of that job description is you're writing a performance review on your staff. Well, how do you write a performance review on a nurse when you've never had a one-on-one with her and you don't know what it's like to do rounds on a patient? So when she comes to you and says, I'm struggling with a patient who is kicking and fighting me because they have dementia, and you're a doctor who just wrote a dissertation on a report and you've never actually been a frontline nurse, there's this huge disconnect. Yet boards of directors are putting those responsibilities on these people. So it's a disconnect in the culture. It's a hierarchy that they've never actually drilled down to think about the actual frontline staff and what we're doing.
Yeah,
And then the nurses, yeah,
they've read about dementia, but they've never seen it. They've never
they've
felt
never
it
seen
or
it.
experienced it. And
No,
then they have to manage and judge somebody who lives it.
who lives it, exactly. And they were themselves never a nurse because they never came up through, that was never their career trajectory. So they were never a nurse and then became a doctor. They went to med school and they became a doctor first.
Yeah, it's kind of like in the military when somebody comes out of like officer school and they were never an infantryman. And
Exactly.
they don't understand what it's like living in the foxhole or
Hmm.
whatever.
Exactly.
So
But
what is
see, yeah,
yeah,
that's strange.
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No, and it's different though, because in the Army, you're allowed to yell at your subordinates, and that builds character. And you're not allowed to say you're a bully. That's just
Right.
the rule of the game. And in doctors and nurses, and even with residents, it's sort of accepted that you're allowed to be bullied. The doctor is allowed to yell at the intern. But what happens is from a psychological standpoint, we have all these nurses and doctors who have PTSD and that are taking stress leaves, and they're sick because they go to work with stomach aches, and they're actually supposed to be in a healthcare environment. And that's the biggest irony. Working in a healthcare environment is the most unhealthiest place to work, and yet you're supposed to be treating people to get better.
Yeah, I mean, think about that. Like, let's spend some time on that. I mean, it's almost
Well,
like
that's why I quit my job because it was the most unhealthiest place. It was the most toxic work environment working in health authorities
but
through my career.
there's this built-in caste system to it. You
Hmm.
know, you got the surgeons and then you got the doctors and then you got the
Yep,
nurses and then you got the I don't know how it all works, but
it is. And
and
you
it's
want
allowed.
it's allowed. And the doctors have a God mentality. So I started as a medical transcriptionist where I plugged in and I listened to doctors dictate and I wrote all the stuff down and transcribed their reports. So I was a fly on the wall. So I heard people's most intimate details, their health information. And then I learned to protect that data. And that's what got me into the privacy realm. So I kind of grew up in that environment from the ground up. But you want a doctor who thinks they're a god when they're operating on you, because you want someone who believes they're a god, because you want them to save your life. But you do not want to work for someone who thinks they're a god because they're not humble. You want a humble leader. You want a leader who is so humble that when you make a mistake, they remember that they're human too, and they don't throw a book at you.
Right. And so it's almost like what it takes to be a great doctor, this sort of God
Mhm.
complex or whatever, which is
Yeah,
really manifests itself, if I'm following you, it manifests itself in sort of a certain confidence that
exactly.
I'm in the, I'm in the OR and I got to make this tough decision or whatever. You need that confidence. You don't need somebody second guessing themselves. But outside of the OR, that translates into something that's, the opposite of humility or the opposite
Exactly.
of actually empathy, which is so great. I mean, to your point, it's such a counterintuitive thing, right? It's
Exactly.
supposed to be a place of caring. It's supposed to be a place of treating patients and taking care of people. And it ends up turning into the people who are trying to administer it, the hearts and hands of these organizations, which are the nurses, the people on the front lines.
Mhm.
They are fighting their own sort of internal battle because of the work conditions that they're subject to.
Exactly. And we are talking about sweeping stereotypes. So the stereotype is a heart surgeon. And so when you were a secretary in the hospital, a heart surgeon and a brain surgeon were the worst people. You never wanted to work for them. I worked for a gastroenterologist, which was a gut doctor. So he was shitty to work for, we used to say. It was tongue in cheek. A pediatrician was the best doctor to work for, because a pediatrician, they work on little babies. So they had the best bedside manner because they were used to working with parents. So they could go into the OR room, they could be a god, but they could come out to the bed and they could talk to the parents and hold their hands.
So
So
why
they were
does
the
that?
best
Yeah. So why does that work? Like,
because they were more human. I don't know why. They just had bigger hearts.
but
It calls a
and
certain
you folks,
personality to the job.
yeah, I'm just wondering, like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg there? Is it like the people with the big hearts, they end up going into the pediatric area, or is
I
it,
think so.
does it reinforce itself? Like, is it a sort of a survivorship bias thing where the people with the biggest hearts end up being the best pediatricians because of these, because of these aspects of the job, or is it kind of the other way? Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, and I don't know. I've never met a pediatrician who was a brain specialist. So maybe there are a few assholes out there that are just really, and then throw in Asperger's. Maybe you never know. But there are some sweeping stereotypes out there.
Yeah, and obviously stereotypes are dangerous, but on the other
Mhm.
side, they also like exist for a reason. And if as a secretary or an admin or whatever, if you actually feel those things on a day-to-day basis and you talk to other folks about it and they say, oh
Yeah.
yeah, I feel that way too. He's a brain surgeon or he's a heart surgeon, to your point.
Hmm.
Um, there's some basis for it often.
Well, because then it's just statistics. It's like the statistics dictate that this stereotype is relatively true.
So what does, so what we're really talking about here, we're going to talk about, we're talking about a kind of a bunch of things, but in the
Mhm.
context of what we're talking about right now, we're talking about sort of cultural elements and how certain players in an organization are enabled or empowered to do sort of um, uncouth things and treat people like garbage.
Mhm.
Um, and those end up being sort of defining elements in the culture that end up trickling down into the other little microcosms that you might see that same microcosm within the nurse's station, where the highest nurse then it's like all that stuff sort of starts to roll downhill. How do we start to fix it, or how do the people at the top, so to speak, fix it? And how do they get that balance of, like, I need somebody who's a great doctor, but I'm going to weed my garden of weeds that are wrecking the lives of the people that I'm relying on to deliver the type of care that our organization has a mission to provide.
That's a good question. I think it starts with educating the masses on how to speak better. And when I say that, I mean I learned to manage up. So when I had a difficult manager, I had to learn to communicate in a more assertive way. So for instance, if a manager came at me and perhaps was attacking what I thought was my character, I had to be able to say to them, when you when you approach me and you're questioning my ability to complete this project on time, I feel like you're insinuating that I am lazy. I want you to understand that you gave me these two other projects to work on, and I was focusing my attention on that. Did I misunderstand that you wanted me to change my priorities? And then give them an opportunity to communicate back to me a change of priorities. It's like we have to re-educate people on how to communicate more concisely, because what happens is when people start attacking character, or I'm sorry, that's really funny when you are you actually calling me lazy? That seems like a silly thing to say. And then people retract and go, oh, I'm not saying you're lazy, I'm just saying I don't understand why you're working on that instead of this. It's like changing the dialogue again, because I don't think people, I honestly like to think that humans are generally good people and we don't come to work to attack people and to belittle each other's characters. I think we bring stuff from home and we're parented a certain way at home that we bring that baggage and we project it on other people unintentionally.
Yeah, and you said something just now about opening up the dialogue, and it's almost really about establishing a dialogue and
Yeah.
opening up a conversation about these things. If you turn your steering wheel and your car goes off the road, you never say, "What an idiot car I have."
Yeah,
You know what I'm
exactly.
saying? Like, but we tend to think that we almost assume negative intent in our subordinates or the other people on our
Hmm.
team, when in actuality, to your point, people are just trying to do a good job. People are generally trying to make a positive impact in the world. I think most people would say that they want to leave the world in a better place than they found it,
Mhm,
right? So all those sort of
exactly.
positive foundational elements are there. And if you can assume those things, then you as a leader can open up the possibility that, okay, well, maybe I was unclear in my direction, or maybe I forgot that that this person's overloaded with 5 projects and they're just trying to prioritize. You can't do 5 things at once, to your point. Um,
Exactly.
so is managing up like, is your, like, you seem like someone who's probably good at managing up, and I'm wondering, and just from your perspective, do you think that that's rooted more in your personality, your assertive personality, or your sort of desire for clarity, or do you feel like it was something that, irrespective of those sort of personality traits, it was a skill that you had to develop, and really everybody needs to develop it?
It was a survival skill. It was me going to a mentor or a colleague at work saying, I think my boss has it out for me. Like, I don't know what's going on. I'm getting these negative vibes from my boss. I honestly feel like he's not happy with my performance. I keep trying to impress him. And no matter what I do, I feel like my boss just is not happy with my performance. And the person said, you need to manage up. And I didn't know what that term meant. And so she gave me some books to read. And she said, this is what it means. It means when your boss comes to you and says ABC, you need to basically turn the tables back to him and repeat ABC back and then ask a clarifying question. She says that is what managing up means. She says because he's sending you mixed signals and you need to clarify that. Now, for me, it was always with my male bosses that I struggled with this. And I don't know if it was a gender thing, but in my experience, it seemed to be the male bosses that would send me the mixed signals. But I also found that it was in my government positions that I struggled the most with this. And I don't know if it was just because in government, I don't know, but I predominantly worked in government, so that's also why it was also my experience. But I always had to take careful notes, but I had to learn. It was a survival mechanism, but it seemed like I worked in a lot of toxic environments. So I always took notes from my meetings. So whenever I went back to someone, I always had something tangible. So it was never personal. I was always like, based on our last conversation, we discussed this. I just need to clarify, was this still the direction we were going, or was there a change in direction? And being a secretary, I was always in a subordinate role. So, and I always was a secretary to executives. So I always was fighting with ego. I needed to be very careful and tactful to tiptoe around the ego, because I never could tell my boss they were wrong. I always had to say, I just needed to clarify that I didn't misunderstand what your intention was. And I was, eventually my career progressed that I was the executive assistant to the chair of the assistant chair of the Department of Pediatrics. I was the executive assistant to the vice president. So you got very good. And then I still fought with some of them still wanting me to get them coffee in the morning. So there was still this sexist thing where they leave a $5 bill on my cubicle saying, double double, get me a double double in the morning. And I would still pretend to like put my files down on top of it saying, sorry, I didn't see your note, because I would still refuse to get them coffee because that was not my job. My job was to be your assistant, which I was very good at, but I would not fetch your coffee. If you were buying my coffee, then I'll get you a coffee, but I'm not going to buy your coffee. And so it was this little dance that we played.
What do you think it is, this ego thing? It's very bizarre, but it's almost like as somebody ascends in an organization, there's more like the ego gets bigger. And when I say bigger, it's almost like becomes more fragile as it grows or something.
It's inflated. It isn't inflated. It's like it's this inflated balloon. But then I always remember it's filled with helium, and if you let the helium out, you're gonna sound like a munchkin when you speak with it. Because you're really a joke. Because ultimately you go to the bathroom and you have the same bowel movement that I do. And that's what I used to always remember. And I had this one woman, she was a dragon lady, and she had, out of her staff,
What
she
is that?
had,
What is that?
oh,
Dragon?
she was a dragon lady. She was the female equivalent of an asshole to work for.
Got it.
So she had 20 direct reports, and 8 of them were out on stress leaves. and they were allowed to return to work, but they couldn't work for her. But the problem was is she was hired to clean up the department. And even though she had all of these people who had personal reasons why they could not work for her because she was a horrible boss, but the department hired her because they wanted a bulldog in the pen. And I knew all of this because I was her right-hand person. I was her EA. So I was the one who did all of her dirty work. I read all of her emails. I knew everything, but I was bound by the rules of confidentiality. And they all wanted me to whistleblow on her, but I couldn't because the whole tenet of my role was to be her representative.
What
So
was that
my
like?
job, I went home every single day with a stomach ache because I knew how she spoke to her subordinates, and I knew that she was very good at her job. She never said anything that was demeaning. She was very professionally demeaning, but she never crossed the line.
So what does that look like?
It was very tongue in cheek, very cutting remarks, but nothing that you could take it to a lawyer. So
So she played the game right. She knew
she
how to play the
played
game. She knew how to be a jerk and cut people and cut them down and squeeze them
exactly.
out. And
And she called into question their performance on things. And everyone, if you put people under a microscope, they're going to fail.
yeah, do you know that saying, at least down here, where it's like everyone is committing like multiple felonies every day? They don't
Exactly.
even know it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, we're all imperfect. No one's perfect. And so, and no one wants to, like, I worked for a person who was a cop. So she taught me amazing stuff, but she literally was an investigative police officer. So when she would come into my cubicle, it literally felt like I was pulled over by a police officer and my taillight was out. And I would get a cold sweat, and she would basically go through my file and she'd tell me all the things I did wrong. And then she's like, how are you gonna fix it? And I literally felt like I was being read the riot act. I learned so much from her, but she had the worst bedside manner. So I literally would break out into a cold sweat every time my boss came into my cubicle. She had a horrible reputation, and eventually the company downsized and maneuvered situations so that she lost her job.
Mm.
And it was a very horrible way that they exited her out of the company. It was by the book. She couldn't fight it with a lawyer, but it wasn't fair. Like
Did she create that in a way, you feel?
she created it because she didn't they tried to send her to leadership courses. She could have tried to be a more fluffy person, but she just dug her heels in it and said no. So she could have met them halfway if she wanted to.
So maybe this is a simplification of like humans, but on one side, you might have somebody who acclimates toward task over human, task over people. They put task first. And on the other side, you have people who put people over task. And at the extremes, you have these jerks that you're talking about, who don't care at all. And maybe they're narcissists, or maybe they're sociopaths or psychopaths or whatever sort of.
Who knows? Yeah.
On that side, I don't know. And then on the other side, sort of the caricature is somebody who just is all talk. They're just all fluffy, like you said, or they're all, it's an empty suit, or, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Why is it that in your mind that as you, again, this is a stereotype or generality, but as you go up higher and higher, there's just so many more people on that first side of the spectrum that I talked about, where it's task over people almost to a fault, or like the rate of sort of bad bedside manner, as you know, as a sort of a shorthand for people who are kind of jerks to work for, the ratio seems to be higher as you go up a company. What is that?
I think it goes back to like sort of that article you wrote. It's about, we're under a pyramid structure nowadays. So when you get to that top of the pyramid, it's lonely at the top and you don't have anyone checking you anymore. So when you're at that top, you're by yourself, your ego gets inflated, and you just start to be king of the castle again. So you've now pushed everyone off of the top of the hill. You're at the top of the castle, and you start to think, I can rule the roost and do whatever I want. And you start to get a little cocky, and you just start playing the game all by yourself.
Do you think it's just because it feels so good to just start to think that, man, I can
Sure
do
it does. Oh yeah, it feels great. If no one's checking you, like I think the world would be a wonderful place if I got to rule it. Don't we all feel that way? If you know what, when you're sitting home alone and you have full remote control, and you get to, and you don't have no kids climbing on you, you have no wife telling you to change the channel, it's just you and that remote, it feels great.
Yeah.
Imagine if it was your company, imagine if it was your world. We all ride that. We don't, it takes a real moral person with a really good compass and real strong ethics to actually want to step up and be a good leader. And I think we've gotten away from teaching people, because what happens is we're not teaching children. Look at what we're feeding children on cartoons. We're not teaching them morals. We're not teaching them ethics. We're not teaching them to be good human beings anymore. So if they're not learning that from a small age, and then we're not putting them in organizations where we're changing the structure, like we really need to be changing the structure of our organizations to be customer focused. Uh, where the customer is the centric model. We need to get away from these hierarchies where it's the CEO, where we make the CEO happy and all the subordinates surround making that CEO happy. It should all be customer focused and value-based focus. And how are we sustaining the environment along the way when we're doing that? If we turn everything on its end, then we have a better shot of having people at the top being better humans.
Yeah. And I think what we're kind of talking about is this thing called CEO disease, which
Yeah,
is what we're describing, right?
exactly.
And so I think rooted in that, again, just to kind of echo what you're saying, is a lack of accountability.
Hmm.
Um,
Exactly.
and so my question to you is, then what is the role of a board? Is a board just a joke?
Oh, I think a board's a joke. I think the board needs to be made, I think boards need to be made up of customers,
Oh,
unpaid customers. So have like be accountable to a cooperative of people. That's who you should be accountable to and pay
yeah.
them shares or dividends. Don't see a board is just a collection of people who are getting paid. So the CEO's friends is what it seems like to me.
Yeah. Yeah. If it's not true, to your point, I think what you're saying is, if it's not
I
truly
know.
objective, if it's not truly objective and there's no true accountability, then what's the point of it? It's a check the box function in and of itself that
Mm-hmm,
does nothing to deflate the ego, or maybe we don't even have to deflate it, but just sort of keep the behaviors in check.
mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, it seems like, the root, the tree is rooted in one person at some level or in one
Yeah.
entity. And if it's not the board, and the board's not, corporate governance and this whole sort of school of thought and all the literature that's on the role
Mm-hmm.
of a board, like that's all very clear. And I think in theory, it's supposed to correct for all the stuff you're talking about,
It
right?
is supposed to, in theory, but do we see it happening?
Well, I think if it was happening, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. You know what I'm
Exactly.
saying? Because this is not a one-off conversation. That
Yeah,
thing I wrote is not a one-off situation. This is like the majority at this point.
exactly. If you were to stop the average person, like take a hospital board. So there's a big pompous board in a hospital, but if you were to stop a patient on the street and say, tell me who your board members are, they wouldn't know. The board doesn't represent the average patient. And so
What do they
we've got,
represent, you think?
they represent, it's just another a collective that are getting paid.
It's a country
So
club.
it's a country club, yeah. And they're so far removed from the everyday patient. So the patients aren't getting a vote. The patients don't know who the board members are. They don't, I've gone to some of these board meetings and they have these town hall meetings where the patients can talk to them, but they're so pompous. They have formal minutes. You get to stand up at a mic and you maybe get to say a few words to them, but you feel like you're talking to a monarchy.
It's a
You
joke.
don't feel, it is a joke. It's you don't feel properly representative, but we need to get back to the grassroots where the people have a vote, the people have a say. You can't even, you have like, I have a granddaughter right now who has cancer, and for us to go visit her when she's getting chemo treatment, we have to pay $25 in parking. So for us to visit our sick grandbaby cost us $25 a day in parking. Now, I wish I knew a board member that I could go to and say, excuse me, my daughter, my granddaughter is sick and I have to pay $25. Who made that decision that you're charging us? I already pay taxes. Like, could we not get a break on the parking fee so that I could just go visit my sick grandbaby?
Yeah. And do you think it is a function of sort of heartless people on the board who are really just kind of out for themselves? Or do you feel like it's a function of this structure is just so big that these well-meaning people who are really trying to make a difference and, hey, I'm getting involved with this board because I want to try to make things better, but they're really just kind of, they're trying to turn a battleship, or they're kind of swimming upstream to such an extent that whatever change they're trying to drive, they just can't. You know what I'm saying? And again, maybe this is it's all over the place. I don't know, but what's your read on that?
I think you're totally right. I think it's just a broken system. They're really trying to turn a battleship. What I'd like to see, and I think it's also an older generation that is sitting in those chairs.
Hmm.
What we need to see is I would love to see us raising smarter entrepreneurs. So as we're raising our little babies to be these ethical, better human beings, I want them to be entrepreneurs. I want them to be dreamers who are taking these old archaic systems that they're inheriting and turning them on their head, saying, let's build a better ship. Like,
Mm.
we had this Titanic that we inherited. Let's build a spaceship, or let's build a yellow submarine, and let's just do something totally that's never been dreamt before and create something totally brand new to have a different deliverable.
So how
Because
do we empower them to do that? And how do we shortcut the impact that you're talking about versus just waiting the 30 years for this new generation to, take the helm of these Titanics, to use your analogy? How do we shortcut that? Which, if we can do that, we can hopefully, cross your fingers,
yeah,
avoid the potential, jadedness that can come from being chewed up and spit out by the machines that they're stepping into.
I think we start saying, you know what, we might have been wrong. We have to let our egos go and say, you know what, we did the best we could with the knowledge we had at the time, but we might have got it wrong, and we're open to new ideas. Because we have to it's the CEOs right now that are in place that have to let their egos go and say, you know what, is there a new way or a new design or something innovative that we can do? And maybe it's these boards saying, we're going to do a scholarship and we're going to open it up to an innovative idea.
Mm.
Bring to us your innovative ideas, and let's open up a scholarship to help these young entrepreneurs um, table this, and let's actually fund it, because we have scholarships for up and coming people. So I think there's ways that we could embrace innovation to do that. But I think what happens is we have to take that king of the hill mentality of saying, I'm right and my way is the only way, and just say, you know what, maybe there's a different way of doing it. Doesn't mean that we're totally wrong, just means that let's take our experience and marry it to something new, and work together.
Yeah, and to use your analogy of the Titanic, it's not totally different than a submarine. Like, they're both in water. They're both sort of
Exactly.
mechanisms to travel, right? Like,
Hmm.
little tweaks can make a big difference.
Yeah, exactly. And we learned a lot from the Titanic. Yes, it sunk, but there's millions of ships that were based on that design that are very successful machines.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Let's Man, this is such an interesting it's such an interesting thing, because it feels like, again, a lot of people get into medicine because they want to make a difference, and then they're, whether you're a nurse or whether you're a doctor, you have these kind of, you're when you're in your pure unjaded state, you're over here, and then when you step into these environments and you step into these structures, as you put it, um, those structures begin to influence us, and the
Hmm.
root of all of our behaviors are some emotions, and those structures, to your point, influence the emotions. If you're driving to work with a knot in your stomach and leaving with a knot in your stomach every day, those are inevitably going to sort of start to translate into how your hands interact with the world in a different way, right?
Exactly.
How do we help, prevent people from getting jaded? I mean, it's just such a complex thing. And I don't want to say, okay, well, this is just too big of a problem. It is what it is, suck it up, or, well, deal with it. It's a caste system in a hospital. It is what it is. But what you're talking about is the same thing that, some of our clients are dealing with, and some of the people who call in on our whistleblower line are dealing with. It's a really pervasive type of a problem. How do we help folks either become more prepared for the bombs that are going to be going off overhead, to use your PTSD
Mhm.
analogy? And how do we help them to not get jaded? Like, where can it start?